age of party democracy has passed. Although the parties themselves remain, they've become so disconnected from the wider society and pursue a form of competition that is so lacking in meaning that they no longer seem capable of sustaining democracy in its present form. So starts Ruling the Void by Peter Mair, the book we're going to be discussing with all of you today. I'm Grant.
I'm Joe. So this is a book that came out in 2013, but we've come back to it how many times because it's only more relevant each year, really. And look at that great title, Ruling the Void. What is the void that the author is writing about?
Peter Mair, this Irish political scientist, uses the specific example of the European Union and politics there. But Mair is really explaining the ways political parties have lost the trust of the public and lost their ties to society, seen in disengagement from politics, as well as volatile election results when people do engage with politics. So it ultimately gets to the fundamental questions of the time that we're living in. Why we have the post-war political order unraveling, the establishment unraveling, the rise of populism, the rise of forms of anti-politics. This chasm between politics and society that's always been there has really widened and become this defining feature of the 21st century. And that really gets to what our channel is about in the first place.
You think we should define our terms?
Well, if the political parties have changed, and that's how Mair looks at this widening gap between politics and society, what were they before and what are they now? What does it mean when we say that the parties are no longer embedded in society or things like that?
Right. Mair says we live in a time of cartel parties and compares it to prior periods of mass politics, mass political parties. How do you define a mass political party?
Well, I think a mass party is something. Maybe we should talk about the time period to ground that, right? Like, when do you see a mass political party? For me, it's sort of the mid to late 1800s to the end of World War II would be how I would define the period of mass politics. And we should get to why. But I think just starting there, do you agree that that's about when we're talking about?
I do think that's the period we're talking about. These mass political parties are actually what created democracy as we know it, especially in Europe, actually.
Mass parties were seen by members as representing their interests within politics, and not the interests of everyone in the public, right? They were seen by members as something under their own control, like, this is my organization, my club. And they were mass organizations that they felt they were running in their own interests. They still had leadership, they still had these things, but this was different than the political parties of today.
How are they different?
Cartel parties are what Mair claims we have now. So we've gone over mass parties a little bit. Cartel parties are basically when somebody says, hey, the parties are the same to me, man, two wings of the same bird. It's the kind of kernel of truth that's in that kind of common sense popular statement, right? Not in a literal conspiratorial sense, right? This isn't about people in back rooms smoking cigars choosing to do this, but instead the parties become less oriented towards having that presence in society where members are important, and they become more part of the state itself, part of the processes, the rules, the institutions of the state, and they're in that position together.
Right. And also, very importantly, they depend on state funding more and more.
Especially in Europe.
Absolutely, it's completely different than the United States. Here, the parties rely more and more on private donation.
But a cartel party, I mean, as it arises, Mair argues that democracy ends up being redefined away from even being about elections or representing people or popular sovereignty, and towards being about laws and institutions and processes.
Right. And there's a gradual move towards that after the end of World War II.
Right, which brings us to the catch-all party. There is an in-between mass parties and cartel parties, which is what's called the catch-all party. Also brings us to a Frankfurt School theorist named Otto Kirchheimer.
Otto Kirchheimer.
Very prescient guy. I'm amazed that he isn't talked about more.
He's really one of the Frankfurt School theorists that you hear about least, actually.
Yeah, right. Before my research, I never even heard of him before this.
Right.
So it's very striking to me that as early as 1954, he's talking about the rise of the catch-all party and these mass parties kind of starting to decline.
He eventually defined a catch-all party by talking about downgrading of the role of the individual party member and de-emphasis of class, specific social class, or denominational clientele in favor of recruiting voters broadly among the population at large.
I would also add, too, like what he's talking about is the party is getting increasingly drawn into the state. The more that they're separated from the street interests in society, the working class, confessional cleavages, so if you're Catholic or not, you're representing that. But the more you get drawn into the state, the more that you get drawn into trying to represent the general interest. The more that you're appealing across class, across religious confession.
There's a kind of common sense. Yeah, that is very logical. And then there's a common sense conclusion to that as well. I think a little bit of popular wisdom here. When you stand for everybody, you stand for nobody. Because there is no magical general interest of society that everybody's on board with.
Right. And that's actually where politics of the state come in as a sort of pretender to the throne. They're a pretender to the throne of the general interest.
So what is the difference between a catch-all party and a cartel party?
It almost feels like the catch-all party is like an early version of a cartel party. What the difference really is that the catch-all party still has a social base. It's weakening, but it's still reliant on being a mass party, but one in decline. It's just one that's loosening up and in a process of cartelization, really. I guess, too, though, what Mair get at is that the cartel party is the same logic, but it's shed of its commitments to a mass base or a social base. It becomes increasingly less reliant on elections or representation, really, through that.
I can quote Ruling the Void here, actually.
Go for it.
In Ruling the Void, Peter Mair is talking about catch-all parties, and he says that the last decades of the 20th century witnessed a gradual but also inexorable withdrawal of the parties from the realm of civil society towards the realm of government and the state, and together these two processes have led to a situation in which each party tends to become more distant from the voters it purports to represent, while at the same time tending to become more closely associated with the alternative protagonists against which it purports to compete. First, party organizations, however defined, are now less well-rooted within the wider society. And second, they are also now more strongly oriented towards government and the state. Thus, if we conceive of parties as standing somewhere between society and the state, the most obvious approach to understanding their role and location within a democratic polity, then we can suggest that they have shifted along the continuum from one to the other, moving from a position in which they were primarily defined as social actors, as in the classic mass party model, to one where they might now be reasonably defined as state actors.
Actually, that gets at something I was sharing in a group chat of ours recently about, I think it was Jamie Harrison, the former DNC head, Democratic National Committee head. And he was complaining about how the electeds have all the power, like the elected Democratic Party politicians, they have all the power. He doesn't have shit. And back in the day with these mass parties, it was different. The party on the ground had more power, or at least there was more of a balance between the party on the ground and the electeds. The party on the ground was actually very important to the electeds because of the ties to civil society that the party on the ground brought to them.
Yeah, I actually want to quote a little bit more of Ruling the Void on that idea of the ties to civil society, because I also think people might ask us what we actually mean by saying the parties used to be more embedded in society. So Mair says evidence of the erosion of the party's social roots is relatively easily adduced. Electoral identification with political parties is now almost universally in decline. So he's saying we've seen statistics, fewer and fewer people identifying as Democrats or Republicans, more people identifying as independents would be an example in the United States. And the sense of attachment to party has been substantially eroded. Levels of party membership are now markedly lower than was the case 20 years ago, and other evidence suggests that those members who remain within the parties tend to be less active and engaged. As workers' parties or as religious parties, the mass organizations in Europe rarely stood on their own, but constituted just the core element within a wider and more complex organizational network of trade unions, churches, and so on. Beyond the socialist and religious parties, additional networks of farming groups, business associations, and even social clubs combined with political organizations to create a generalized pattern of social and political segmentation that helped to root the parties in society and to stabilize and distinguish their electorates. Over at least the past 30 years, however, these broader networks have been breaking up. That also invokes a little bit of what's going on in society at the same time as the parties are breaking down, right? The increasing individualization of society, atomization, alienation in the new forms that it's taking. But
Mair talks about that in the book too, I think.
He does talk about it. But I think just to focus in a little bit, that is some of what we mean about social embeddedness when we talk about political parties and why that's changed. They really, it's almost unfamiliar to us today. We didn't grow up in a world that even had this. From the time we were born, but political parties used to be mass organizations that were embedded in very complex social networks.
Right, and not only are they not anymore, but the social networks don't exist anymore.
Right. The actual civil association is also not there, and so, there's all these schemes as well to like revive politics and to revive. Really, when people talk about reviving politics, they're kind of pretending that what we have now isn't politics, because it's ugly and it's unflattering. And to say that this is politics is to offend the political mind a little bit, I think. But what they say when they say they want to bring back politics is that they want to bring back mass politics. And when you look at the state of civil society and social organization, it's hard to imagine how they'd actually have a base to do so from.
Right. There's no social interest that appeals to, really. There's no independent reason for people to want to make politics better, except to this very narrow sliver of society.
So how does this apply to American politics? Are the U.S. parties cartelized? And did they go through these other stages? By the way, we've been saying cartel parties, right? Like, just to be clear, Mair is invoking the idea of a cartel in exactly the way that you understand the word cartel. That's what he's saying.
Right, and it's interesting too, because I think in that other book that I think it was co-written with Richard Katz. It was a collaborator of his. This book came out about 7 years after Mair died. It's called Democracy and the Cartelization of Political Parties. Early in the book, here's a quote actually. Katz and Kolodny, 1994, described as a six-party national party system of the United States with presidential, Senate, and House Democrats, and similarly Republicans, in many ways organized and acting as three separate and generally allied parties. We saw American parties through the 1970s and 1980s as being characterized by what we would later call a cartel consisting of presidential Democrats and Republicans, Senate Democrats and Republicans, and House Democrats, but excluding the House Republicans, who had been in the minority since January 1955 and appear to be condemned to permanent minority status. On the one hand, this meant that the other five parties had little need to accommodate their concerns. And on the other hand, that meant that the House Republicans had little incentive to join with the others in acting responsibly. In the end, this led to Newt Gingrich's Contract with America, which challenged the general elite consensus regarding the characteristics of responsible policy, put the Republicans in the majority in the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years, and by showing that a frontal attack on the establishment and its sense of what was acceptable could be electorally successful at the national level, effectively broke the cartel. So in a way, Gingrich was another sign of actually the polarization of the political parties in the United States in a way that didn't really exist in Europe. I think there was an early cartel system in the United States in some ways, or an early cartel-like system in the United States that was effectively broken by House Republicans that decided to play populist against it.
Right. That's really interesting. And it also raises questions like, are the US parties, did they reform a new cartel at that point? Or did they become something different? But you could argue too that American parties didn't cartelize the same way as European or other ones because they're so legally written into the electoral process that they don't need to. I mean, one of the things about cartel parties in Mair's understanding is, why do you become a cartel? Lots of reasons, right? Like, I don't think this is just an idea that they had and they're freely choosing to do it. They're responding, the parties, in all of what Mair's talking about, the parties are responding to things that are largely outside of their control, first of all.
Right.
But they are working to keep out smaller outside parties.
Right. And the American parties definitely collaborate on that. And sometimes they'll use, third parties as Trojan horses to, screw up the other party. But for the most part, they've collaborated to have this duopoly in the United States.
Well, like I said, they're legally written into the election process in a way that not a lot of other countries do.
Right.
And then there's stuff that's going to sound like old news, but gerrymandering and so on.
In some ways, there is a cartel, but in other ways, there isn't.
It seems like a cartel. It seems like there's a cartel when things matter, in a lot of cases. But yeah, were Democrats and Republicans ever mass parties in the European sense to begin with, right? Did we ever have a mass party system in the United States? I mean, you had some kind of patronage heavy spoils systems. And I will say that a patronage heavy spoils system where you give out a bunch of money to people who vote for you is, in a way, a more direct representation and engagement with society than whatever they seem to be doing now with this kind of elite activist fraction of society that is in the political class. But formal party membership was never big in the United States. You're a registered voter or supporter. You're not really a member in the same meaningful way. On the other hand, many of the establishment centrist parties of today in Europe are the fossilized remains of old radical Marxist socialist parties. So the American parties have always been kind of weak, but they're weak but baked in. It's an interesting kind of paradox.
The thing is, too, it gives rise to a weird adaptability for them, actually, especially with the primary system, because the rise of the primary system, that was a way to get over their own weakness, really, or their rising weakness.
And the contemporary primary system in the United States, again, another thing that's been around as long as you and I have been alive,
Right.
but it's actually not been there forever.
No, it starts after 1968. You had the DNC riots in Chicago over, which is basically, anti-war activists versus the old Democratic establishment, the labor unions, the remainder of the big city bosses, that type of thing. So the primary system comes in to be more democratically responsive. And this also comes in like right around the time that campaign finance is exploding. And again, that's because the parties are getting weak across the West, and advertising, it's really expensive. It's more expensive than these parties can really upkeep on their own. So that brings in the need for new donor sources. When you have weaker unions and weaker civil social organizations, where do you get money from? There's two sources you can get it from. A, big corporations. B, the state. In Europe, they lean a lot more on the state. In the United States, campaign finance since the 70s, heavily reliant on private big donors, which of course has always been a source of contention in the United States. But now it's everybody kind of accepts it as a given almost, not a given that they like, but still. But at the same time, though, what you often hear in America is we need to get big money out of politics. Big donors, I mean, they don't have the same role in Europe that they do here in the United States, but there is still this mistrust in European politics. Mair lays out the empirical foundation of that in a big way. And a lot of that ties into the European Union and this drive among the national political classes in Europe to move further and further away from their societies. They're delegating their responsibilities outward. It's not even so much about their own states anymore, but outside of their own nation states.
Yeah, that's a big theme of Ruling the Void that we really should touch on as well as we go through this. So Ruling the Void extrapolates from the European Union to make these observations about the party system from the beginning of modern, industrial society till now, how the parties have changed. But he does have very specific things to say about the European Union as well that can apply in ways probably more to the Democrats in the United States than really to like US politics as a whole. But also actually the Republicans also fall in with this, but it's much more easy to see in something like the European Union because it's kind of based around this as a whole project. But as you have these cartel parties emerge, or this cartel, they're parties that have been around, but they adopt this cartel system in response to material conditions, they become more and more involved in these international institutions that take them away from any kind of accountability directly to their voters. This is what Brexit was ultimately about, for example. You have these issues today, Mair is very prescient about this. You have the issue of European unionism and integration. Populist parties, it's such bread and butter for them to be able to crusade against the EU because they can take this line of national sovereignty, right? And what is that really about, right? Because it's not just about nationalism. It's about this redefinition of democracy away from the results of elections, the will of the people, those sorts of ideas, and more towards those processes and legal institutions that we talked about. But those institutions are even international architecture. And it increasingly looks like the political classes around the world feel more comfortable with each other in these international architectures than they do with their own public.
I think in the United States, in the late 20th century, the parties kind of adapted in a weird way. It's actually fascinating how the American parties are so adaptable. I think it's because of their weakness.
They do compete a bit more around this axis of pro-politics, and I would say the GOP is a kind of unpopular populism that has streaks of anti-political characteristics, just through Trump having taken them over in the way that he did. But if they're defining things around populism and anti-populism internally, they're still not competing in the old social representation way. That doesn't make them mass parties.
I guess the way to see it too, when it comes to why the parties were so adaptable, is think about the South. And I think we talked about this before, really. There was never a strong social base to politics in the Southern United States. And the ripping open of Jim Crow and the destruction of it makes that pretty obvious. And it even gets to like why the Republican Party could sort of dash to the right and abscond with white Southern voters on this sort of anti-federal government posture. Maybe that anti-federal government posture sort of gets at later questions around popular sovereignty and national sovereignty. It's obviously in very mixed form because it's also mixed up with the question that was live at the time of you upended the white supremacist order in the South. And I think one winds up, we talked about this with Carter 2 months ago, that like ultimately I think one wound up winning over the other, but in a way that has become invisible in the political discourse, really. Because Carter could win back the South on an anti-Washington platform, but he wasn't running as a racist.
Right. And that also brings out the distinction between the GOP and their own voters as well.
Right. It's the degree to which that they could like weld ideology to anti-political sentiment, which the new right was actually able to exploit, I think, and quite well for some time. I just had a thought actually on Goldwater. There is a great quote about him in reference to Southern strategy, which he was pushing, as early as, the early 60s. I think he said it was going hunting where the ducks are. Isn't that catch-all mentality in a nutshell, really?
Rather than seeing yourself as the representative of a particular group, you identify with the political party as a kind of state organ You look for voters anywhere.
It seemed to be about creating a right that could govern at a national level, really.
Mm.
And they had to do that by getting out from ahead of a social movement, the civil rights movement.
It's not something that's coming up from the membership. It's coming from the party leadership. How do we, Barry Goldwater, presidential candidate, how do we adapt?
And you even saw that like at the senatorial level too. I think I pointed out an example of a Kansas senator. I forgot his name exactly. He was a Midwestern conservative. He voted for all the civil rights bills, but he still helped push, Strom Thurmond up the Senate ranks when he joined the Republican Party in 1964. What does that tell you?
All right. Well, even good old Joe Biden was friends with segregationists, right?
There is a cartel party for you. There is something to that. Now that you think, I didn't even make that connection before, but think of like Joe Biden and his buddies, love of the old Senate races like Eastland or Thurmond. It gets at like how there was a sort of like there was a sort of like a bi-party cartel that Katz was talking about. You could definitely see it in like how in that relationship really.
So to pivot a little bit, how has the world changed since Mair wrote Ruling the Void? Because this came out in 2013.
And he died in 2011. Yeah.
He died in 2011. This came out in 2013. He talks more about electoral disengagement than outright anti-politics in a lot of ways. But he does talk about electoral volatility,
Right. Yeah. And he talks about anti-politics too, even.
And so electoral volatility, how would you define it? I mean, I think of establishment parties that have been around for however long crashing in election results, or rapid switching between parties, or even it can be expressed in terms of the candidates that are successful within a party changing in ways that we would qualify as volatile. Stranger people running for office under the party banner, for example.
Right. Like Corbyn could not have happened before the internal reforms of Labor in 2015. And the reason why that happens, of course, is because Labor was basically a busted project before that. So they decided, we'll let rust on left-wing activists determine, which that basically was the party membership. Once they opened things up, determine our next leader, as long as a handful of members of parliament give the thumbs up. So that's how Corbyn gets in. He gets the endorsement of a handful of Labor MPs, and then the Labor Party membership, which now ballooned up into the hundreds of thousands for the first time ever, voted him in. But again, like this is a narrow core of the left-wing activist base in Britain, really. It really has very few ties to mass union membership that the old Labor Party might have had. And of course, the irony was, Corbyn was supposed to be the return of class politics to Labor, and yet he oversaw the complete flattening of class differences in party voting in his tenure as the Labor leader.
To continue the point, though, about Mair and how the world has changed, he's living through a period of disengagement, and the book reflects that, but the possibility for re-engagement and higher turnout doesn't falsify his thesis, at least not the higher turnout of the kind we've seen, which is volatile, rather than a reattachment to the party system. Because it's not re-engagement with the parties in any lasting sense. And even with Corbyn, with what you're talking about, it becomes a census of the left-wing activist-oriented people in the political class and loses its working class basis, right as it claims to be the ascent of the working class. So it's not really a reattachment to the mass party system, but it's this electoral volatility with establishment parties repeatedly almost being shut out of power for good because of these new challengers and having to find ways to stay in. And then the new challengers themselves don't have a social base. They aren't mass politics returning either. And so they're unstable and vulnerable to collapsing.
Right. And actually the Katz Mair book, it's kind of wobbly towards the end, trying to engage with this question. Now, let me read you that part. I found it. But there is another way in which democratic performance could be improved, even if economic or other policy performance lags. That would be for the apparent consensus/conspiracy among the mainstream parties that austerity is necessary, that the tide of immigration cannot or should not be stemmed, that Europeanization must proceed, etc., to be broken. Many voters might still not get the policies they want, but at least they would be able to express their frustration without having to turn to the populist extremes. There are some signs that this may be possible in the selection of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the British Labour Party and the resulting move to the left of the party's program.
And Katz also seems to see potential for the party system to reemerge around populism or in relationship to it in some ways elsewhere, I believe. But
yeah, a little bit later in the book, yeah.
It just runs into the same issue of not having a social base that the establishment parties have. Filling the void feels more cautious than that.
No, it does. It's fascinating too, though, because he does put in a very interesting insight about how the old socialist parties, I think of the early Second International, used to lambaste the elite cadre bourgeois parties of old in the late 19th century as a sort of cartel. And he draws parallels between that and like current populists. This is what he says. Projecting from this, one might look for a split in the populist movements akin to that which occurred in the socialist movement, with social democrats moderating both their demands and the rhetoric and ultimately becoming part of the mainstream. I mean, you do see that with some populists. Maloney, for instance. But I don't think it really resolves anything. I mean, it didn't even resolve anything in the 20th century, really. Like the moderation of the social democrats, in a lot of ways, that was sort of the first sign of, I think, crisis for the left, actually. It does relate to how the socialist parties and the labor parties wound up becoming part of the political system itself and would eventually get cartelized into the state. You know, that they would vote for war credits or moderates, even in the early 20th century. That was an early sign of what was to come later. But
right. Voting for war credits, as in you're referencing the socialists in Germany aligning with the decision to conduct World War I.
Right. Or that also happened in the rest of Europe, too.
That's just the one that's seen as the great betrayal that ruined everything. So that leads me, though, to, are we still in a cartel party era? And how much is populism a feature or a bug of the current era?
In all reality, this is kind of a process of decomposition that definitely enters like different phases, but it's hard to draw like solid lines between them. I could call the 1960s and 1970s catch-all party eras for sure. Like that looks pretty clean, but it gets blurry at the edges. Whereas with the cartel party era, it does seem like populism is an intrinsic feature of it, just because when there's no opposition, that leaves a vacuum, because there's always going to be opposition in politics. And what's the opposition going to be other than populism?
Interestingly, all of what we're talking about, I mean, how does this undermine the popular theory, especially on the left, around neoliberalism?
Yeah, that's funny, isn't it? Well, because you see, as early as the 1950s, the Social Democratic and Labor parties moderating on policy, becoming increasingly enwrapped in the state, and appealing to people that weren't working class in a catch-all formation, really.
And usually when the left parties are sort of seen as becoming more centrist and selling out, people think of the 80s, neoliberalism, economic changes, that sort of thing.
Right, but in all reality, they were trying to get away from their old base right after World War II.
For decades.
Yeah. And what does that say? Like, what was driving that? It wasn't a reliable way to do politics. And that's actually a good question in and of itself. Like, why does it disintegrate? And why is it right after World War II? Katz and Mair try to get at it. They talk about the changing financial needs that political parties had. That's true. But I don't know if it doesn't seem satisfactory to me, though, because it really happens right after the war. They do get it a little bit about like how there was a sort of common sense of a European project and a sort of camaraderie between the political class that got liquidated by fascism or encamped by fascism. Because obviously, you know, centrist liberals, Catholic politicians, socialists, a lot of them wound up under the same unpleasant heel of the Nazis, for instance. So a lot of these people just wound up knowing each other and becoming comfortable with more or less establishing the same political framework after the war. But I think it goes beyond that, too.
You have an entire international political architecture being reconfigured. I think in the two world wars, you have
massive destruction.
You have massive destruction in the two world wars in a way that is socially damaging and obviously caused by mass politics. I'm not saying people consciously related to it that way, but there is something about a world after World War II where you can understand people being more skeptical of being party members and of politics as a solution to their problems.
Well, I think what made the post-war consensus work is that the pillarization, that's a term of it in Dutch politics. They have these several pillars of organized mass society that were represented by political parties. The Catholics, the Protestants, the Socialist Labor Party. You had all these competing political parties, or something like Weimar, for instance. You had people duking it out on the streets until the Nazis came in and sort of underwent osmosis with the state. I think the way that you could re-legitimize politics after World War II, it had to be around a consensus where all the parties could agree on something and, again, not be fighting on the street, not cause a huge social ruckus, not cause untold destruction to an entire continent.
Which is what they had just done.
You do see some theorists say that the working class had been tamed, even as early as 1949.
I think there's also something to the idea that perhaps the social question under modern industrial conditions that the working class faced, and that was such a drive, like the socialist parties are such a driver of the socialist parties are such a driver of party formation in Europe, especially,
and democratic formation too,
and of democracy even. And so there's this prediction with the rise of the socialist parties that capitalism is heading towards a kind of final conflict. And if the world wars are sort of the busted flush of that in some abstract way, this also makes sense from that perspective, perhaps.
It's better to just not conflict, or it's better to not do war on that level.
What I'm saying is, if the revolutionary elements within society were shunted in a certain way by the world wars, right? This final conflict happens, but in this distorted way, or in a sense, this final conflict is preempted by the world wars. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say it's a manifestation of it, though you do have the Russian Revolution. But if this social question that the mass parties originally formed to answer, right? Like if socialism is a key question of the rise of mass politics, whether you're for or against socialism, if socialism itself, the construction of barracks communism in the Soviet Union, and the working class is dead at the front lines and betrayed by their supposed representatives in the socialist parties who voted for war credits. I'm just saying there's also something to, why did mass politics go away? Well, if the masses, so to speak, invented mass politics as a vehicle for trying to conquer political power and resolve the social question, there's some things that happen that make that, again, it's sort of like a shunted away thing for that dynamic. Do you know what I'm saying?
I know what you're saying. If they could create mass politics, they could also destroy it.
Yeah.
I think they did by stepping back a little bit. And I think the thing is, when you read the Frankfurters or people like Merleau-Ponty in the late 1940s, they're all talking about the working class becoming conformist. I don't think it's that they became conformist. I think it's more like, all right, all that failed. All that was a disaster. Maybe we need to step back and take a breather right now.
We hear from grumpy left-wing theorists and grumpy right-wing theorists, how much they loathe the end of mass politics. But the end of mass politics, political disengagement, it inhibits the state in certain ways, right? Like you can't really, in the way, at least in the form that it took in the 1930s, right? You can't really have fascism without mass politics. So for the public to withdraw from politics in this way,
it's protective.
it constrains the possibilities. I mean, it's not to say that cruel, barbaric things aren't done by the state all the time nowadays, but on that scale, I think people, I'd encourage people, because oftentimes if you're interested in politics, if you're listening to this, right, your first instinct is to see people being disinterested in politics as them being sheep, them being stupid. 20th century was a mess. That's what I'll say.
It was. And I think there was a realization of this after 1945, really. It even gets at why something like Vietnam is so offensive to so much of the public, actually. It even gets to, remember there was a poll I saw from like 1970 where it suggested that actually it was older voters that were most anti-war during the Vietnam War.
Right. We think of it as young people, but people who had been through all of that
were more likely to be. And I mean, I'm not saying that there wasn't a polarization perhaps among younger people. I could definitely buy that there was.
Right.
Because obviously, if you're getting drafted, that raises the stakes. Obviously, there were people burning their draft cards. Obviously, there were young people getting protests. And there was a social base to that. Because there was a real social self-interest and something at stake there. But why would an older person oppose a war? If you think of it in the context we just talked about, it makes a lot of sense. They thought that peace had been realized in a way, the sort of democratic peace. This is something that people don't get about mass politics too, especially if you're deep in politics. It was highly contentious. It was extremely violent. It led to some of the most murderous states in history.
When the state can no longer, through civil social organizations that tether people to politics to some extent, when the state can no longer negotiate with society, right? When society appears as a void to politics, right? They're just staring into a void. They don't know what to do with society. They don't know how to negotiate with it through institutions because there aren't institutions to do so. Well, that constrains the ability of politics to broker deals with the public. And a lot of the time, the deals that politics brokers with the public are destructive.
Absolutely.
And this isn't to oppose social change, by the way, or social movements.
No, but those are different things, which we will also get into later on.